Hey everybody, this video is an updated build guide to the Condition Damage Warrior for PvE dungeon solos. I posted the first one when Sinister Gear came out, and since then I've refined the build a bit after playing a lot, and I've made a few changes to the traits and the gear. Additionally, the Might nerf was a cruel and unfortunate change for this build. Whereas a Berserker build gets hit by the Might nerf in the direct damage department from the power reduction, a Sinister build is hit both in the direct damage and condition damage department, so for the Condi build it was kind of a double nerf. While this is definitely uncool, the build is still very functional and everything it was good at before it's still really good at. Before we get into the build itself, I just want to make one thing quite clear. This build is in no way a replacement for the meta Berserker build. And in an organized group, this build has basically the same DPS as a failing Strength Warrior, but with none of the Might stacking for the party. Basically, this build only exists for solos, open world, and dungeons. It is really fun to solo open world and play Silver Waste using this build, but I would never really recommend it to replace a meta build. It's also a pretty big gold and time grind to get all the Sinister gear for it, so the only way I can recommend it is if you have the time and the deep pockets for it. But with all that out of the way, let's get into it, and I will go over the build if you're still with me. Alright guys, so for gear, for the armor, I recommend Sinister gear with Aristocracy runes. The Aristocracy runes give us condition damage and a rather large bump to our Might duration, which allows us to build up a really large amount of Might over time, which also increases our condition damage and our direct damage further. It doesn't hurt that it does buff our direct damage so substantially, because in a Sinister build you do DPS both from direct damage and condition damage. Full Ascended Sinister armor is ridiculously expensive and a major Silver Waste time grind, so I recommend exotics for most players, as the DPS for the armor is not particularly noticeable. For trinkets, I recommend the Full Ascended Sinister as well. The Ascended trinkets are mostly easy to get from Personal Story, though to get Full Ascended will require a bit of Silver Waste grind. I highly recommend taking the time to get the Ascended trinket, since the DPS difference between exotic and Ascended is significant, and in the case of the trinkets. For the back piece, there is unfortunately no Ascended Sinister. As a result, I recommend Ascended Rampagers. There are Rampagers exotic back pieces out there if you don't want to craft an Ascended version. Rampagers is the best stat allocation for our purposes of this build, but if you have a Rabid or Celestial back piece already, those are definitely close enough to not bother replacing with. For our weapons, I recommend 2 swords, Sinister, stats on both. Due to the 100% condition cap, our bleeds will be maxed out without having to use Giver's weapons, so we can take the Sinister swords. This is a nice boost of stats since it gives us a lot more condition damage and quite a bit more power than Giver's. For sigils on one sword, I recommend Sigil of Strength, which combos with the Aristocracy runes. On the other sword, I recommend Sigil of Bursting for the additional 6% buff to condition damage. So the next, on swap, we're going to have a Giver's Longbow. Now, why Giver's Longbow for using Sinister on the swords? Well, the answer is we need the 20% condition duration from the Giver's Longbow to apply to our burns. The more burning we can stack on the boss, the less often we will have to swap to Longbow, and the more often we can camp sword. Camping sword equals more Might and more bleeds, which equals more DPS. I do advocate having 2 Longbows. One should have Corruption and Energy for difficult boss fights where you need the extra dodge, and the other, which I consider the main one all around, should be Corruption and Smoldering. This is the set you would use for any boss that doesn't tax your dodges too much, so you can achieve 100% condition duration on your burns, which will maximize your DPS. If you guys are going to go after infusions, Malign are optimal. If you don't really care about fractals, you can use the World v World infusions to save a bunch of gold, but I will say that using infusions on this build is insane overkill and a total waste of your money. However, there's a lot of people out there who have tons of extra money, so go wild if that's what you want. So that's basically it for the gear. Pretty straightforward. And next we will move on. Alright guys, so next up we're going to look at traits. The standard loadout is 36023. In strength, we take dual wielding. The 5% direct damage boost is nice, but it isn't a huge benefit. The real reason we go this deep into strength is for the 15% condition duration, which is a big help to our torment and our burning. Arms actually contains a ton of good traits for this build. However, the stock choices are going to be deep cuts to help us get to 100% bleed duration. Blade Master, which is a 10% always-on crit chance boost to our swords, which will trigger more bleeds on crit and more might from our strength sigils. And Dual Wield Agility for an increased attack speed to our sword auto attack, which in the end will give us more bleeds and more might. In Tactics, we take Inspiring Banners. This will allow us to maintain 100% uptime for Banner of Strength and Banner of Discipline. In a long solo battle, having your banners up 100% of the time is a massive boost to your DPS, which makes this a key trait. It also helps that just from going 2 into Tactics, we get 10% boon duration, which will help us maintain our might even further. In Discipline, we take Signet Mastery. Signet Mastery gives us more fury and lots more might, both of which are very good in solo situations. But the real prize for going 15 deep is Fast Hands, which allows us to swap to Longbow whenever we need the fire field, and allows us to go back to Sword without completely ruining our bleed stacks. But I will talk more a little bit about the rotation coming up next. But for now, this is the traits, and pretty straightforward. Not too much has changed. Previous iteration of the build went 4 into Discipline and only 2 into Strength, but I think this situation works out to significantly better DPS for the build. Alright, so that's up with the trait changes, and next we'll move on to the rotation description. Alright guys, so the DPS rotation for this build is pretty simple. You want to auto-attack with Sword as much as possible to maintain and maximize your bleed stacks. While in Sword, you want to be sure to impale on cooldown in order to maintain the maximum amount of torment stacks possible. The only time you're going to swap to Longbow is when the burning on the boss is about to expire. That way you can reapply your burning and maintain 100% uptime on burns. When it is time to swap to Longbow, you're going to immediately use your Combustive Shot, followed by Arcing Arrow for the Blast Finisher, then Fan of Fire, and end it with Pin Down. And then you'll swap back to Sword. In normal circumstances, the burning that you apply will last at least as long as Pin Down's cooldown. This means you should never have to swap back to Longbow without Pin Down being available. While on Longbow, as stated before, your bleeds will rapidly disappear. So Pin Down is vital for keeping your bleeds high during the swap. As a result, that's why you always want to swap to Longbow only when Pin Down is available. Additionally, when Banner of Strength comes off cooldown, it's almost always better to wait till casting it after Combustive Shot and Arcing Arrow into your fire field for another Blast Finisher. This may mean having some Banner downtime, but so long as you don't wait too long, it's usually better to wait for the fire field to drop it. A couple other notes. When it comes to parry and riposte, it's a great way to get additional bleeds on your target. If you need the block to survive, by all means use this skill defensively. However, if you don't need the block for survival against a particular boss you're fighting, use it offensively to block an attack that you would otherwise normally dodge to apply 3 additional stacks of very long-lasting bleeds to your target. So one final note is Final Thrust. Final Thrust, it's very debatable whether it's actually a DPS increase. My thought is the time it takes you to Final Thrust, you could probably get 2 auto attacks in. So it's probably costing you about a bleed and a half. So it's very debatable whether Final Thrust is going to be worth doing. My napkin math tells me that you want to Final Thrust if you have Banner of Discipline down. But if you don't have Banner of Discipline down, then you don't want to Final Thrust. If you happen to be fighting a boss like Lupicus, where you're using Signet of Stamina, you probably want to avoid Final Thrust and just focus on maintaining your bleeds. So that's just it for the quick notes on the DPS rotation for this build. Next up, we'll discuss consumables and wrap things up. Alright, so lastly we have consumables. For this build, the best food is Rare Veggie Pizza, or the discount version, which is Koi Cakes. This food is necessary to maximize our condition duration and is absolutely vital. There's simply no alternative that comes close to either rare veggie pizza or koi cakes. For our second nourishment slot, I recommend toxic focusing crystals for the 100 condition damage and 10% condition duration. It's simply amazing, and there's literally no other nourishment that comes close to as good as this is. However, I do want to note that the toxic focusing crystals are quite expensive. I think they're about 50 silver each. So for times when you don't want to min-max and you're just, say, looking to run around silver wastes and have fun, just use whatever quality tuning crystals fits your budget. My advice, just to use the 4.2s or the 5.3s because they're relatively cheap and they give you at least a decent boost to your condition damage. But when you're actually going for like a legit awesome solo time, you definitely want to use toxic focusing crystals. So that is it, guys. This is the updated Sinister Warrior build and guide. I hope you guys enjoyed it. The build really is a blast to play, and hopefully someday we can all cross our fingers and hope that condition damage gets a savage buff somewhere, and we'll get to play this build and maybe have it be part of the meta. But for right now, I will not be holding my breath on that happening. Well, anyway, guys, if you have any questions, feel free to hit me up in the comments. But otherwise, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time.